Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading Chapter 11, so let's get into it. Quentin had Professor Geiger send them back to Chesterton. They materialized smoothly in the center of town. Bless you. Geiger, a middle-aged woman, cheerfully overstuffed, had offered to send them directly to Quentin's house, but he'd forgotten his parents' address. It was the middle of the afternoon. Quentin didn't even know what day it was. They sat on a bench on a historic green where a minor battle had been fought in the Revolutionary War. Sun-dazed tourists drifted past them. It was not a time for able-bodied 20-somethings like him to be out and about with nothing to do. He should have been at the office or acquiring a graduate degree, or at the very least playing touch football stoned. Quentin felt the daylight bleaching the energy out of him. God, he thought, looking down at his leggings, I really have to get out of these clothes. Though Chesterton was one of the East Coast's premier venues for colonial reenactments, that ought to make them a little less conspicuous. So that went well, he said. Starbucks? Julia didn't laugh. They were becalmed. They sat in silence under the old oaks, the king and queen of Fillory, with nothing to do. The air was full of weird modern hums and drones he never used to notice before he lived in Fillory. Cars, power lines, sirens, distant construction, planes in the jet stream, laying double-ruled lines across the clear blue sky. It never stopped. He'd met Julia here once, he reminded himself, or not that far from here, in the graveyard behind the church. That was when she told him that she still remembered Brakebills. You do not have a plan, do you? Julia stared straight ahead. No. I do not know why I thought you would. That haughty anger was back. She was waking up again. You have never really been here. Out here in the real world. Well, I visited. You think magic is what you learned at Brakebills. You have no idea what magic is. Okay, he said. Let's say I don't. What is it? I'm going to show you. Julia stood up. She looked around as if she was sniffing the wind, then set off abruptly across the street at a scary angle. A silver Passat honked and scritched to a stop to avoid hitting her. She kept walking. Quentin followed more cautiously. She led them away from Chesterton's main drag, such as it was. The neighborhood turned residential fast. The din of traffic and commerce died away, and big trees and houses bloomed on either side of the street. The sidewalk became bumpy and irregular. Julia was paying a lot of attention to the telephone poles for some reason. Every time they passed one, she stopped and studied it. Been a while since I did this, she said, mostly to herself. Has to be one around here somewhere. One what? What are you looking for? I could tell you, but you would not believe me. She was full of surprises, was Julia. Well, he happened to have some free time just now. 5 more minutes went by before she stopped at one particular telephone pole. It had a couple of blobs of fluorescent pink spray paint on it, which might have been left there by a sloppy lineman. She stared at it, her lips moving silently. She was reading the world in a way that he, Quentin, could not. Not ideal, she said finally, but it will do. Come on. They kept walking. We are going to a safe house, she added. I need to move the mic. I'm going to keep punching it if I don't. They walked for literally 2 miles through the suburban afternoon light, in the process crossing the town line from Chesterton into the less posh but still desirable town of Winston. Children trailing home from school eyed them curiously. Sometimes Julia would stop and study a chalk mark on a curb or a stray spray of roadside wildflowers. Then she would press on. Quentin didn't know whether to feel hopeful or not, but he would wait for Julia's plan to unfurl itself, especially since he didn't have any suggestions of his own. Though his feet hurt, and he was on the point of suggesting they steal another car. Except that they would have been wrong. Like Chesterton, Winston was an old Massachusetts suburb, and some of the houses they passed were not just colonial style, but genuinely colonial. You could recognize them because they were more compact than the other kind, denser and set back from the road in damp, rotting pine hollows, where raggedy grass lawnlets were locked in an endless running battle with encroaching rings of pines, armed with their acid needles. The newer houses, by contrast, the colonial-inspired McMansions, were bright and enormous, and their lawns had gone completely shock and awe on the pine trees, of which one or at most two examples still stood, shivering and traumatized, to provide compensational balance. The house they stopped at was the first kind, authentically colonial. It was starting to get dark out. Julia had logged another couple of telephone pole paint blobs, one of which she'd stopped and studied quite closely using some kind of visual cantrip that he hadn't caught because she hadn't wanted him to catch it. She actually hit it with one hand as she cast it with the other. The driveway dived down sharply into the hollow. Generations of kids must have murdered themselves on skateboards and scooters trying to go down it and stop before they slammed into the garage. Student drivers must have martyred themselves on it practicing hill starts in standard transmission cars. They clomped down it on foot. Quentin felt like a Jehovah's Witness or an overage trick-or-treater. At first, he thought the lights were off, but when he got close enough, he saw that they were, in fact, all on. The windows were papered over with butcher paper to keep them dark. "I give up," Quentin said. "Who lives here?" "I don't know," Julia said brightly. "Let's find out." She rang the doorbell. The man who opened the door was in his mid-20s, tall and fat, with a hair helmet and a red caveman face. He wore a t-shirt tucked into sweatpants. He played it cool. "What up?" he said. By way of answering, Julia did an odd thing. She turned around and pushed her long, wavy black hair with one hand, giving the man a quick look at something on the nape of her neck. A tattoo? Quentin didn't catch it. "All right," she said. It must have been because the bouncer grunted and stepped aside. When Quentin followed, the man narrowed his already piggy eyes further and put a hand on Quentin's chest. "Hang on." He took up a pair of ridiculously tiny opera glasses, toy-like, that hung on a thong around his neck, and studied Quentin through them. "Jesus," he turned to Julia, genuinely aggrieved. "Who the hell is this?" Quentin said. "Cold water." Quentin stuck out his hand. The man, whose t-shirt said Potions Master on it, left him hanging. "He is your brand new boyfriend." "He is your brand new boyfriend," Julia said. She took Quentin's hand and dragged him inside. Bass was bumping somewhere in the house, which had been a nice house before somebody did a profoundly shitty renovation job on its interior, and then somebody else beat the crap out of the shitty renovation. Said renovation must have happened in the 1980s, as that was the era of chic on offer. White walls, black and chrome furniture, track lighting. The air was heavy with stale cigarette smoke. There were chips and divots in the plaster everywhere. This didn't look like a place where he wanted to spend a lot of time. He was doing his best to remain hopeful, but it was hard to see how this was getting them any closer to Fillory. Warily, Quentin followed Julia up a half flight of stairs and into the living room, which contained a weird assortment of people. The place could have passed for a halfway house for teenage runaways if it weren't also a halfway house for 20-something middle-aged and elderly runaways. There were your standard goth casualties, pale and skinny and worryingly scabby, but there was also a guy with 5 o'clock shadow and a wrecked business suit of non-negligible quality, talking on a cell phone saying, yeah, in a tone of voice that suggested that there was actually somebody on the other end who cared whether he said or nuh-uh. There was a 60-something woman with an Arctic white Gertrude Stein haircut. An old Asian guy was sitting on the floor with no shirt on all by himself. In front of him on the white carpet stood a burnt-out brazier, surrounded by a ring of ashes. Guess the cleaning lady hadn't come today. Quentin stopped on the threshold. "Julia," Quentin said, "tell me where we are." "Have you not guessed yet?" She practically glittered with pleasure. She was relishing his discomfort. "This is where I got my education. This is my break bills. It is the anti-break bills. These people do magic? They try." "Please tell me you're joking, Julia." He took her arm, but she shook it off. He took it again and pulled her back down the stairs. "I'm begging you." "But I am not joking." Julia's smile was wide and predatory. The trap had sprung, and the prey was writhing in it. "These people can't do magic," he said. There's no safeguards. They aren't qualified. Who's even supervising them? No one. They supervise each other." He had to take a deep breath. This was wrong. Not morally wrong, just out of order. The idea that just anybody could mess around with magic, well, for one thing, it was dangerous. That's not how it worked. And who were these people? Magic was his. He and his friends were the magicians. These people were strangers. They were nobody. Who told them they could do magic? As soon as Breakbills found out about this place, they'd shut it down with a goddamn vengeance. They'd send a SWAT team, a flying wedge with Fog at the head of it. "Do you actually know these people?" he said. She rolled her eyes. "These guys? These guys are just losers." Julia led the way back into the living room. The only thing the denizens of the safe house had in common, besides their general seediness, was that a lot of them had the same tattoo. A little blue star, 7-pointed, the size of a dime. A heptagram, but solid colored in. It winked at Quentin from the backs of their hands, or their forearms, or the meaty part between their thumb and forefinger. One of them had 2, one on each side of his neck, like Frankenstein's neck bolts. The shirtless Asian guy had 4. As Quentin watched, he started in on some involved casting that Quentin didn't recognize, staring glazedly through the web of his working hands. Quentin couldn't even look. A red-headed man with freckles, a pint-sized Dennis the Menace type, was sitting up on the gray slate mantelpiece by himself, monitoring the scene. But when he saw them, he boosted himself down and strutted over. He wore an oversized army jacket and carried a beat-up clipboard. "Hi, folks," he said. "I'm Alex. Welcome to my dojo." "You are?" "I am Julia. This is Quentin." "Okay. Sorry about the housekeeping. Tragedy of the commons." In contrast to everybody else in the room, Alex was chipper and businesslike. Check your stars, please. Julia did the thing again where she showed him the nape of her neck. Right? Alex's ginger eyebrows went up. Whatever he saw impressed him. He turned to Quentin. And you? He does not have any, Julia said. I don't have any. He could speak for himself. So did he want to take the test? Because otherwise he can't stay here. I understand, Julia said. The really incredible thing was that she wasn't even mouthing off to this guy. She was being civil. She, a queen of Fillory, respected the fuck-up protocol of this place. Quentin, he wants you to take a test, she said, to show you do magic. I want lots of things, too. Do I have to do it? Yes, you have to fucking do it, she said evenly. So do it. Is it just the first level? Everybody who comes here does it their first time. You just make a flash. You probably have a fancy name for it. Show me. Julia ran through 3 well-rehearsed hand positions, lickety-split, snapped her fingers, and said, Isk. The snap produced a little pop of light like a flashbulb. Okay. Hang on, Quentin said. Those hand positions weren't quite generic. Can you... Come on, people, Alex said, not so chipper now. Are we doing this? Quentin saw now that Alex had 8 stars, 4 on the back of each hand. That must make him king of the Flophouse. Come on, Quentin. Okay, show me again. She did the spell again. Quentin came at it, trying to crook his fingers the way she did. Breakbills taught you all straight lines, your hands approximating Platonic geometry, but these positions were loose and organic. Nothing lined up, and it had been 2 years since he'd worked with real-world circumstances. He tried it once, snap, and got nothing. Then nothing again. This earned him a round of ironic applause. The locals were taking an interest in this transaction. I'm sorry, one more try and then you're out, Alex said. You can come back in a month. Julia began to show him again, but Alex put a hand over hers. Just let him try. The bouncer, potions master, had come in from the front door and was watching with his arms folded. Quentin could hear other people saying, Isk. Every time they did, a flashbulb would go off. Screw this. He wasn't going to pick up some corrupt hedge witch spell in 30 seconds that would probably screw up his technique. He was classically trained and a master sorcerer and a king to boot. Let there be light. Just a bunch of symbols that is in some sort of Aramaic, he said. Let's see who here's got good Aramaic. He closed his eyes and clapped his hands loudly. The light was white and blinding, a flashbulb at close range right up in your face. For a second, the whole room, shitty carpet, listing totiary lamps, starring faces, was frozen. All the color driven out of it. Quentin had to blink his vision back to normal, and he'd had his eyes closed. There was a beat of silence. Holy, someone said. Then everybody started talking at once. Alex didn't look happy, but he didn't throw them out either. Sign in, he said. He blinked and blotted his eyes on his sleeve. I don't know where you learned that, but just get your flash working next time. Cheers, Quentin said. Alex peeled a blue star sticker off a sheet and stuck it on the back of Quentin's hand. Then he handed Quentin the clipboard. Where it said, name, he wrote, King Quentin, and handed it to Julia. When she was done, Quentin dragged her out through the kitchen. With its bumpy linoleum floor and its 15-year-old easy-bake-looking range and its countertops crowded with a multicolor metropolis of unwashed glassware. Enough was enough. What the hell are we doing here? He hissed. Come on. She led him deeper into the house, down a hall that in another saner universe, would have accessed Daddy's study and a TV room and a laundry room until she found the cheap hollow core door that opened on the basement staircase. He closed it behind them. The chilly, mildewed silence of suburban basements everywhere embraced them. The stairs were unfinished pine planks, shaggy with cobwebs. "I don't understand this, Julia," he said. "You don't belong here, any more than I do. You're not like these people. You didn't learn what you know from a bunch of unlicensed losers in a frat house. You can't have." They were alone except for a room full of taped-up cardboard boxes, a dead TV the size of a washing machine, and half a ping-pong table. "Maybe I am not who you think I am. Maybe I am an unlicensed loser, too." "It's not what I'm saying." Was it? He was still trying to get his head around this place. "I can't believe they haven't burned this whole house down by now. I think what you are trying to say is that you do not think they are good enough. They do not meet your standards." "This isn't about standards," Quentin said, though he felt the ground getting marshy under him. "This is about... Look, I paid my dues. That's all I'm saying. You have to earn this kind of power. You don't just pick it up at the 7-Eleven with your Big Gulp and your Pokemon trading cards." "And what did I do? You think I did not pay my dues?" "I know you paid your dues." He took a deep breath. Slow down. This place wasn't the problem. The problem was getting back to Fillory. What did he call this house? A dojo? Dojo, safe house, same thing. They are safe houses. He is just a dork. Are there a lot of them? 100 maybe in this country. There are more on the coasts. Jesus Christ, it was an epidemic. What was that test back there? You mean the one you flunked? That is the test to be a first-level magician. You have to be 1 to come in here. To pass the test, you get a star tattooed on you. You can stay. Most people get them on their hands somewhere obvious. The more tests you pass, the more levels you go up, the more stars you get. But who runs all this? That Alex guy? He's just a den mother. Takes care of the house. The ranking system is self-policed. Any magician can ask another magician of equal or lower level to demonstrate the test corresponding to their level, or any of the levels below that, she recited, to prove they know their shit. If you do not know your shit, you get busted down pretty fast. Huh. He wanted to find fault with the idea, but couldn't quite do it on the spur of the moment. He filed it away for later, discrediting. "So what level are you?" By way of an answer, she turned around and showed him what she'd shown the doorman, and Alex. There was a blue 7 pointed star tattooed on the nape of her neck. Its upper points disappeared into the roots of her hair. She must have had to shave to get it done. It was like the ones he'd seen upstairs, except bigger, a silver dollar, and it had a circle in the middle. Inside the circle was a number 50. Wow. He couldn't help but be impressed. Ginger Balls back there only had 8. So you're a 50th level magician? No. She took hold of the hem of her blouse, crossing her arms in front of her. Wait a minute. Relax, playa. She yanked the back of her shirt up, but only halfway. It was covered in blue stars, dozens of them in neat, straight rows. He counted 10 across. There must have been at least 100. She dropped her blouse and turned back to him. What level am I? I am the best there is. That is what level I am, and fuck you for asking. Come on, I am getting us back to Fillory. She knocked on a heavy fireproof door, the kind that in most basements leads to a furnace room. It slid sideways on rollers. The man sliding it sideways looked like a by-the-numbers prepster, with short blonde hair and a salmon-colored polo shirt, except that he was only about 4 feet tall. Dry, prickly heat billowed from the room. "What can I do for you this fine evening?" he said. His teeth were bright and even. "We need to go to Richmond." The small man wasn't completely solid either. He was translucent around the edges. Quentin didn't notice at first until he realized that his eyes were tracking things behind the man's fingers that he shouldn't have been able to see. They were well and truly through the looking glass now. "Full fare tonight, I'm afraid. It's the weather. Stresses the lines." He had the twinky mannerisms of an old-timey train conductor. He gestured for her to come inside. "Only the lady, please," said the translucent prepster. "Not the gentleman." Defense to Julia's secret extra break bills magic scene notwithstanding, enough was enough. Quentin's grasp of real-world circumstances was rusty, but not that rusty. He whispered a quick, clipped series of Chinese syllables, and an invisible hand gripped the man by the back of the neck and yanked him back against the cinder block wall behind him so that his head bonked against it. If Julia was surprised, she didn't show it. The man just shrugged and rubbed the back of his head with one hand. "I'll get the book," he said. "Do you have credit?" It was a furnace room, hot and made of unplastered cinder blocks. There was an actual furnace in it, with a fire bucket full of sand next to it. But there were also two old-looking, full-length mirrors leaning against one wall. They looked like pier glasses that had been salvaged from an old house, fogged in places with wooden frames. Julia had credit. The book was a leather-bound volume in which she wrote something, stopping in the middle to do mental arithmetic. When she was finished, the man looked it over and handed them each a string of paper tickets. The kind you'd get if you won a skee ball at a carnival. Quentin counted his. 9. Julia took hers and stepped into the mirror. She disappeared like she'd been swallowed by a bathtub full of mercury. He thought she would. Mirrors were easy to enchant, being somewhat unearthly by nature anyway. Now that he looked at them more closely, he saw the telltale sign. They were true mirrors that didn't invert right and left. Even though he'd just seen Julia walk right through it, he couldn't help closing his eyes and bracing himself to bang his forehead against it. Instead, he passed through with an icy sensation. Crude, he thought. A cleanly cast portal shouldn't make you feel anything. What followed had the feeling of a movie montage. A series of shabby, nondescript back rooms and basements with an attendant in each one to take one of their tickets, and another portal to step through. They were traveling on a makeshift magical public transit system, basement to basement. These amateurs must have ginned it up piecemeal. Quentin prayed that somebody out there was doing quality assurance on something other than a strictly voluntary basis, so they wouldn't end up materializing 2 miles in the air, or directly into the mesosphere 2 miles underground. That would be a real tragedy of the fucking commons. In some cases, whoever set the portal up had a sense of humor. One was in a TARDIS-style English phone booth. One portal had a mural on the wall around it. A giant circus fat lady bending over and lifting up her dress so that you had to step right into her ass. One stop was completely unlike the others. A hushed executive suite somewhere high up in a skyscraper in some unidentifiable nighttime metropolis. From this height, at this hour, it could have been anywhere, Chicago or Tokyo or Dubai. Through a smoky pane of glass, possibly one way, Quentin and Julia could see a room full of men in suits deliberating around a table. There was no attendant here. You were on the honor system. You dropped your ticket into a little bronze idol with an open mouth, and you hit the mirror. There are rooms like this all over the world, Julia said as they walked. People set them up, keep them running. Mostly they are fine. Sometimes you get a bad one. Jesus. They'd done all this, and nobody at Breakbills had a clue about it. Julia was right. They wouldn't have believed it was possible. Who was that see-through prepster guy? Some kind of fairy. Lower fairy. They are not allowed upstairs. Where are we going? We are going my way. Sorry, that's not good enough. He stopped walking. Where specifically are we going, and what are we doing there? We are going to Richmond, Virginia, to talk to somebody. Good enough? It was, but only because the bar for good enough had gotten very, very low. One portal was unexpectedly dead, the room empty and dark, the mirror smashed. They backtracked and haggled with an attendant who rerouted them around the dead node. They gave the last of their tickets to a meek, pretty young flower child with dishwater hair, center parted. Julia marked the woman's ledger. Welcome to Virginia, she said. They'd slipped in time as well as space somehow. When they came upstairs, the first thing they saw was morning sunlight in the windows. They were in a big house, nicely appointed and immaculately kept, with a Victorian feel. Lots of dark wood and oriental carpets and comfortable silence. They definitely traded up from the Winston house. Julia seemed to know the layout. He followed her as she prowled through empty rooms as far as the doorway of a generous living room, which revealed another face of what Quentin had mentally tagged as the underground magic scene. An older man in jeans and a tie was holding court from an overstuffed couch to 3 teenagers, undergraduate-type girls in yoga pants who watched him with expressions of awe and adoration. My God, he thought. These people were absolutely everywhere. Magic had gotten out. The antimatter containment field had collapsed. Maybe there had never been one. The man was demonstrating a spell for his audience. Simple, cold magic. He had a glass of water in front of him, and he was working on freezing it. Quentin recognized the spell from his first year at Breakbills. Having completed it in what Quentin thought was a basically correct but overly showy style, the man cupped his hands around the glass. When he took them away, it had a skim of ice on it. He'd managed to break the glass, which the expanding ice often did. Now you try it, he said. The girls had their own glasses of water. They repeated the words in unison and tried to imitate his hand positions. Predictably, nothing happened. They had no idea what they were doing. Their soft pink fingers were nowhere near where they needed to be. They hadn't even cut their nails. When the man noticed Julia standing in the doorway, his face went to shock and horror for about a half second before he was able to bring up a facsimile of delighted surprise. He might have been 40, with carefully mussed-browned hair and a fringe of beard. He looked like a large, handsome bug. Julia, he called. What an amazing surprise. I can't believe you're here. I need to talk to you, Warren. Of course. Warren was working hard to seem like the master of the situation, for the benefit of the room, but it was clear that Julia was very low on his list of people he wanted surprise visits from. Hang tight for a minute, he told his acolytes. I'll be right back. When his back was to the undergrads, Warren dropped the smile. They crossed the hall into a den. He had an odd rolling gait, as if he were managing a club foot. What's this all about, Julia? I've got a class, he said. Warren, he added to Quentin with a very wary smile. They shook hands. I need to talk to you. Julia's tone was stretched thin. All right. And before she could answer, he said under his breath, Not here. In my office, for God's sake. He ushered Julia toward a door across the hall. I'll just wait in the hall, Quentin said. Call me if... Julia closed the door behind them. He supposed it was fair play, considering that he'd parked Julia in the hall outside Fogg's office. This must be as weird for her as going back to Brakebills had been for him. He couldn't make out what they were saying, not without putting his ear to the door, which would have attracted even more attention from the girls in the living room, who were peering at him curiously, probably because he was still dressed in the raiment of a Florian king. "Hi," he said. They all found something else to peer at. Raised voices, but still indistinct. Warren was placating her, playing the reasonable one, but eventually Julia got under his skin and he got loud too. "Everything I taught you. Everything I gave you." "Everything you gave me?" Julia shouted back. "What I gave you?" Quentin cleared his throat. Mommy and Daddy are fighting. The whole scene was starting to seem funny to him. A clear sign that he was becoming dangerously detached from reality. The door opened, and Warren appeared. His face was flushed. Julia's was pale. "I'd like you to leave," he said. "I gave you what you wanted. Now, I want you out of here." "You gave me what you had," she spat back, "not what I wanted." He opened his eyes wide and spread out his arms. "What do you want me to do?" "Just set the gate," she said. "I can't afford it," he said through his teeth. "God, you are pathetic." Julia walked stiff-legged back through the house, back the way they came, with Warren trailing after. Quentin caught up with him in the mirror room. Julia was scribbling furiously in the ledger. Warren was busy with his own issues. Something odd was happening to him. A long twig was poking through his shirt at the elbow. It seemed to be attached to him. It was like a dream that just went on and on. Quentin ignored it. They seemed to be leaving anyway. "See what you do to me?" Warren said. He was trying to twist and snap off the twig, but it was green and bendy, and there seemed to be another branch sticking out from his limbs under his shirt. "Just by being here, you see what you do?" He finally wrenched it off and waved it at her accusingly in his fist. "Hey," Quentin said. He snapped in front of Julia. "Take it easy." They were the first words Quentin had addressed to him. Julia finished writing and stared at the mirror. "I cannot wait to get out of here," she said, not looking at Warren. The meek dishwasher woman looked horrified by all this, another of Warren's acolytes without a doubt. She had faded even farther into her corner. "Come on, Quentin." He got the freezing shock again, and this time, when they stepped through the transition, wasn't instantaneous. They were somewhere else, somewhere dim and in between. Beneath their feet was masonry, old stone blocks. It was a narrow bridge with no guardrails. Behind them was the bright oblong of the mirror they'd come through. Ahead of them, 20 feet away, was another one. Beneath them, on either side, was only darkness. "Sometimes they pull apart like this," Julia said. "Whatever you do, do not lose your balance." "What's down there, under the bridge?" "Trolls." It was hard to tell if she was joking. The room they emerged into was dark, a storeroom full of boxes. There was barely room for them to push their way out of the mirror. The air smelled good, like coffee beans. No one was there to greet them. The coffee smell explained itself when he found a door and opened it onto a cramped restaurant kitchen. A cook barked at them in Italian to move along. They squeezed past him, trying not to burn themselves on anything, and out into the dining room of the cafe. Threading their way out through the tables, they emerged onto a wide stone square. A beautiful square, defined by sleepy stone buildings of indeterminate age. "If I didn't know better, I'd think we were in Fillory," Quentin said. "Or the Netherlands." "We are in Italy. Venice." "I want some of that coffee. Why are we in Venice?" "Coffee first." Bright sunlight on paving stones, clumps of tourists standing around, taking pictures and studying guidebooks, looking both overwhelmed and bored by it all at the same time. Two churches fronted the square. The other buildings were a weird Venetian jumble of old stone and old wood and irregular windows. Quentin and Julia walked over to the other cafe on the square, the one out of whose kitchen they had not just magically burst. It was an oasis of bright yellow umbrellas. Quentin felt like he was floating. He'd never been through so many portals in one day, and it was disorienting. They'd already ordered before they realized they had no euros. Fuck it, Quentin said. I woke up in Fillory this morning, or maybe it was yesterday morning. Either way, I need a macchiato. Why are we in Venice? Warren gave me an address. Someone who might be able to help us. A fixer. Kind of. He can get things. Maybe he can get us a button. So that's the plan. Good. I like it. He was up for whatever as long as coffee was involved. Great. After that, we can try your amazing plan, which you do not have. They sipped their coffee in silence. Dreamily, Quentin studied the chaotic surface of his macchiato. They hadn't drawn a milky leaf on it the way they would have in America. Pigeons strutted in between the cafe tables, picking up unspeakably soiled crumbs, their clawed toes looking livid and pink this close up. Sunlight washed over it all. The light in Venice was like the light in Fillory. Stone light. The world had changed again. It wasn't as neatly divided as he remembered it, between the magical and the non-magical. There was this grubby and anarchical in between now. He didn't much care for it. It was chaotic and unglamorous, and he didn't know the rules. Probably Julia didn't like it either, he reflected, but she hadn't gotten to choose, not the way he did. Well, his world hadn't done them any good. They would go rooting around in hers for a while. So, who was that Warren guy? Quentin said. Seems like you guys have some history. Warren is nobody. He knows a little magic, so he hangs around the college and tries to impress undergraduates and teach them some things so he can bang them. Really? Really. What happened to him at the end there, with his arm? What was that? Warren is not human. He is something else, wood spirit of some kind. He just has a thing for humans. When he gets upset, he cannot keep up his disguise. So did Warren bang you? He said. Who knew where it came from? It just bubbled up out of nowhere, a flash of jealousy, sour and hot like acid reflux. He didn't see it coming. He'd had a lot to absorb in one day or night, whatever it had been, and it was just a little too much too fast. It spilled over. Julia leaned across the table and slapped Quentin. She only did it once, but she did it hard. You have no idea what I had to do to get what was handed to you on a plate, she hissed. And yeah, I banged Warren. I did a lot worse things, too. You could almost see the waves of anger coming off her like fumes off gasoline. Quentin touched his cheek where she'd hit him. I'm sorry, he said. Not sorry enough. A few people looked over, but just a few. It was Italy, after all. People probably hit each other all the time. With that, we will end. And next week, we will be reading chapter 12 and 13. So we'll see you guys next week.